Ron Howard has always been the calm center of chaos, a director who believes in dignity, restraint, and kindness. But when he was asked about the darker side of the business that raised him, his expression changed. "You would not believe what those legends did when the camera stopped," he once said quietly. To him, the golden age of Hollywood was not golden at all. It was a world built on silence and complex moral compromises. A world where fame excused a great deal. The same actors who shaped America's dreams also had complicated and often troubling lives behind closed doors. And now, decades later, Ron Howard is willing to reflect on their complex legacies. Errol Flynn was the rogue behind the smile. Before there was James Bond or Jack Sparrow, there was Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling hero who embodied charm, danger, and reckless desire. On screen, he was the perfect adventurer. Off screen, he was known for a lifestyle of excess and scandal. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, Flynn arrived in Hollywood during the 1930s and became an overnight sensation after Captain Blood in 1935. The studios built an empire around his charisma, but beneath the polish lay a man known for his arrogance and personal struggles. By the 1940s, his reputation was a subject of intense public scrutiny, culminating in a highly publicized trial that divided America. Flynn faced serious legal challenges, with the full force of the studio system mobilized to protect his image. He was acquitted, yet his behavior continued to be a source of controversy. In private letters later revealed, Flynn wrote about his lifestyle in ways that would shock modern audiences. Ron Howard once described learning about that era as a turning point. "When I realized the stark contrast between the Hollywood image and a more complicated reality." To the public, Flynn remained a rogue. To insiders, he was a cautionary tale. His struggles with health and finances consumed him. By 1959, at just 50, he passed away in Vancouver. For Howard, Flynn's story became a blueprint for understanding the moral complexities of old Hollywood, a reminder that charm can hide a multitude of sins. Kirk Douglas was the man who could not stop fighting. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas represented the perfect contradiction of Hollywood's golden era, a man who spoke of honor and justice on screen while possessing a famously intense and demanding nature off it. Born to poor immigrant parents, Douglas climbed his way out of poverty through raw willpower. By the time Spartacus made him a global icon, he had everything. But those who worked with him remembered his powerful presence, a drive that never turned off when the camera stopped rolling. Crew members described Douglas as fiercely demanding, with an intensity that could be intimidating. Howard, who studied Douglas's performances, later admitted, "There is a kind of fire under that smile, the kind that could consume a person." That intensity would follow Douglas for the rest of his career. He was a figure about whom many stories were told, and his name has been connected to long-standing, unproven rumors from the 1950s that have been a subject of public discussion, particularly in later memoirs. Douglas never faced any legal charges, and these claims existed within a system often defined by its silence. On film sets, his presence could inspire and command in equal measure. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, called him the most driven man I have ever met. Ron Howard once reflected that the lesson from Douglas's career was about the nature of power in Hollywood. When Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996, many saw an old man seeking peace. But for Howard, it was the final act of a performer who had spent his life wrestling with his own formidable nature. Faye Dunaway was a study in intensity. If Errol Flynn embodied scandal and Kirk Douglas symbolized fierce drive, then Faye Dunaway represented a formidable and exacting standard. To Ron Howard, she was proof that challenges on set did not always come with raised voices. Sometimes they came through an immense need for control. Born in 1941 in Florida, Dunaway's rise was meteoric. From Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 to Chinatown in 1974, she seemed untouchable. But behind that brilliance, stories of her difficult behavior on set were whispered across the industry. Crew members spoke of her being hard to please and her exacting demands. Her mommy dearest co-star once described a tense atmosphere on set. Ironically, while playing Joan Crawford, a woman infamous for her intensity, Dunaway reportedly embodied a similar demeanor. Director Frank Perry later said the production was incredibly challenging because of her behavior. She was known for being particular about technical details like lighting. Ron Howard, years later, cited her as an example of what happens when an actor's pursuit of perfection can create a difficult environment. The stories did not stop there. On other films, she was reportedly involved in conflicts with crew members. Her former manager once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she embodies that level of commitment." By the 2000s, her reputation affected her career. Directors became reluctant to work with her, citing her as a challenge. When a journalist asked Ron Howard about her legacy, his response was diplomatic. She chased perfection so hard it sometimes came at a cost. For Howard, she symbolized the price of a certain kind of intensity, a warning that talent must be paired with collaboration to be sustainable. John Wayne was a towering and divisive figure. Few figures towered over Hollywood like John Wayne. To millions, he was the embodiment of a certain American ideal. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching him, the reality behind that image was more complicated. "When I learned more about his personal views," Howard once reflected, "I saw a more complex figure than the hero on screen." Born Marion Morrison in 1907, Wayne rose through the studio system by projecting a myth of unshakable masculinity. By the 1950s, he was more than an actor. He was a symbol. He held strong, traditionalist views that often clashed with a changing America. On film sets, he was known for his strong personality. Technicians who failed to meet his expectations were often sharply criticized. Fellow actors noted that when Duke was angry, the set became tense. Howard later called that kind of atmosphere the opposite of collaborative creativity. Wayne's publicly stated opinions have been widely criticized over time. He made statements about Native Americans, Black communities, and social progress that are viewed as deeply problematic by modern standards. His 1971 Playboy interview remains a controversial document, revealing a perspective that many found to be out of touch and offensive. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed with director John Ford over the interpretation of his character, a racist Confederate veteran. Ford pushed for a more critical portrayal, while Wayne resisted. In the final cut, the character's flaws are evident. Ron Howard, who later studied that performance, said, "It's a powerful performance because you see the character's darkness clearly." Even in his final years, Wayne never disavowed his earlier statements. He died in 1979, still hailed by many as an American icon. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his story became a lesson in separating the art from the artist. "The myth survives," Howard once said, "but it's important to examine the complex man behind it." Roman Polanski is a figure defined by his actions. For Ron Howard, the name Roman Polanski represents a difficult truth, that artistic genius can coexist with profound personal failings. "I admired his films before I knew about his personal life," Howard once admitted. "Then I realized talent does not absolve a person." Polanski's rise was meteoric. A survivor of NZ occupation, he seemed destined for tragedy long before fame. His breakout films made him a genius in the eyes of critics, but the darkness in his life was not fiction. In 1977, Polanski was arrested and pleaded guilty to the charge of unlawful sex with a minor. In a decision that shocked many, he then fled the United States before sentencing and remains a fugitive. Hollywood split in two. Some condemned him, while others continued to celebrate his work. For Howard, then a young filmmaker, the reaction was eye-opening. Polanski's exile became one of Hollywood's most significant moral controversies. He continued directing abroad, winning an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist, a moment Howard described as complex and difficult for many. As the audience rose in applause, Howard refused to stand. "I thought of the crime that was committed and how applause must sound in that context," he said. When Polanski won Francis Caesar Award in 2020, it sparked fresh protests. To Howard, that moment symbolized a long overdue reckoning. "It took the world decades to fully reconcile his art with his actions," he told Vanity Fair in 2021. Polanski remains free in Europe, his name synonymous with one of the industry's most enduring ethical dilemmas. For Howard, his story embodies the danger of separating the artist from their conduct. Mickey Rooney was the smile that hid struggle. If Roman Polanski symbolized a moral breach, Mickey Rooney embodied the illusion of Hollywood, the idea that public joy could mask private pain. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals, the discovery of his troubled life was sobering. He was the face of joy, Howard said once, but behind that smile were well-documented personal struggles. Born in 1920, Mickey Rooney was Hollywood's first true child superstar. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built an empire on his grin. But fame at that scale came at a cost. He married 8 times, faced financial ruin due to gambling, and spoke openly of his personal demons. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, wrote about his ego and insecurities. Behind the scenes, the struggles deepened. In his later years, Rooney became the subject of an elder abuse case where he testified about financial exploitation. But decades before that, the toll of his lifestyle was evident. Former co-stars like Judy Garland were in his orbit of shared studio pressure and personal turmoil. By the 1960s, his career had declined. He faced addiction and bankruptcy. In a 1979 interview, Rooney claimed, "I have lived 1,000 lives." But as Ron Howard later reflected, those lives were marked by a relentless search for stability. Even in old age, Rooney expressed bitterness about his career and treatment. When he died in 2014, his story was seen as a poignant example of the perils of child stardom. For Howard, Rooney's story was a final piece in a pattern, proof that the golden age's smiles were often performances. He made the world laugh while he was struggling inside, Howard said, and maybe that is the most tragic part of all, when the performance becomes a prison. For Ron Howard, these stories were never about revenge. They were reflections on a complex history. Hollywood's golden age was not made of gold at all. It was built on silence, compromise, and complicated lives hidden behind fame. And as he once said, the most challenging truths are not in horror films. They are in the stories the spotlight tries to forget. Which of these 6 legacies do you find most complex? The rogue, the titan, or the struggling star? Let me know in the comments.